A military takeover shakes Sudan. The army arrests the prime minister, dissolves the government, and declares a state of emergency. Has Khartoum's democratic transition fallen apart? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the coup in Sudan. After weeks of tension, Sudan has once again witnessed a hostile takeover. Several high-ranking officials, including Prime Minister Abdala Hamdok, have been detained by the army, who says it will now take charge of the country's transition to democracy.
Honorable citizens, I salute you. In just half a century, people stood 3 times to record in history that the Sudanese people refuse to be led by an individual or a group which does not believe in freedom, peace, and equality. When the youth of the December Revolution chanted these slogans and went out in the thousands, the leadership of the armed forces responded and took the time to achieve their dream of building a state with these slogans at their core: freedom, peace, and equality, with complete conviction that the Sudanese people deserve to have a state and dream of achieving these slogans in it. We stress here that the armed forces intend to complete the democratic transition until the country's leadership is handed over to an elected civilian government who can bring these slogans to life.
Well, even before Abdel Fattah al-Burhan made that statement, Sudan's largest pro-democracy movement was calling on all citizens to resist a military takeover, and thousands heeded those calls.
An urgent call to all Sudanese civilians who want to protect their revolution. What the military is doing is a betrayal to all civilians on all fronts. It is the duty of all civilians to move and to block all the roads outside to prevent any military force to move. Right now, all of us must unite to show the truth. It's to be or not to be, and we will.
The return of the old regime is impossible, no matter what was the excuse and the justifications. The return is impossible. This is the first statement of the people. Women and men are refusing any kind of fraud on democracy and the civil life.
This oppression that we're enduring from the military junta, which is represented by only 5 people, is really big. All of us should act and not stay inert.
Well, Monday's events in Khartoum are the culmination of a chaotic few weeks in Sudan. Just last month, authorities foiled a coup attempt by forces loyal to former President Omar al-Bashir, but that did little to stabilize the situation. Rival protests have since taken place across the country, some in support of the transitional government, others asking the military to do what they did on Monday, seize power. But to fully understand why Sudan is in such a fragile state, we have to look back at history. In 1989, with Sudan in the midst of a civil war, Omar al-Bashir seized power in a military coup, ousting the democratically elected government of Sadiq al-Mahdi. Parliament was dissolved, political parties banned, and a free press became a thing of the past. Bashir ruled with an iron fist, quashing any dissent. In 2013, more than 200 anti-government demonstrators were shot dead. Then, 6 years later, after 3 decades of rule, the military forced the president to step down amid massive protests. But 2 months later, security forces shot at demonstrators, demanding a handover to civilian rule. In August that same year, the Sudanese army and civilian leaders agreed to a power-sharing deal. A year later, Sudan's transitional government and rebel groups signed a historic peace agreement aimed at ending conflict across the country. Well, deals like that were supposed to help spearhead Sudan's path to democracy and civilian rule, but right now, they appear to have failed, and the international community is concerned.
I condemn the ongoing military coup in Sudan. Prime Minister Hamdok and all other officials must be released immediately. There must be full respect for the Constitutional Charter to protect the hard-won political transition. The UN will continue to stand with the people of Sudan.
The chairperson calls for the immediate resumption of consultations between civilians and the military within the framework of the political declaration and the constitutional decree.
It is important to respect all decisions and agreements that were decided upon, refraining from any measures that will disrupt the transitional period and shake stability in Sudan.
Well, to look further at the situation in Sudan, let's get straight to our panel. Here with me in the studio is Elkhatim Elmahdi. He is an executive producer with TRT Arabi and a commentator on Sudan. Dr. Babikir Ismail joins us from London. He's a political analyst and writer. In Washington, D.C., we have Cameron Hudson, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center and former chief of staff to the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan. And in Bangalore is Sudanese activist Mohamed El Mustafa. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let me start in the studio, and I want to start broad. Before we look actually at the sociopolitics of what's behind what's happening now, the military alone has decided that it will take over the country's transition to democracy. There's a lot of irony in that statement, but do you think it can be done, or is the military looking simply to transition back to military rule?
Thank you. Absolutely no, because the military has been in power for the better part of the past 60 years. Sudan gained its independence in 1956, and since that time, the military rule took over 3 times. This is the 4th coup d'etat in Sudan. And the first one was 8 years, 16 years, and then 30 years. And they all, funny enough, they all start by saying that we are here to help pave the way towards civil and democracy. But at the end of the day, it's pure and simple power grab. They need to stay in power because aside from the socioeconomics of this venture in all, they have to stay in power in this particular case because in the past 2 years, they have been involved in atrocities, crimes that are still being investigated. What happened in June 2nd in Khartoum, June 2nd, 2019, when they violently dispersed the peaceful sit-in in Khartoum. And then what came next after that, and they are involved in let me backtrack here for 1 second. Burhan, General Burhan, and his deputy, General Hemeti, and most of the military council, which is the military component, used to be called the military component, were essentially were called the Supreme Security Committee, which was in power during al-Bashir last days. So they have they are involved in all of this.
So they have a history that they
Yes.
seem to be repeating here, in your opinion. Let me ask Babikir if you share that opinion. I mean, is the military simply incapable of power sharing?
I think this partnership started in April 2019. The military owned the full power after the coup that they have achieved, and they toppled out General al-Bashir. Then voluntarily, and with the intercession of the African Commission, they agreed to share power with civilians. And they have done so for 2.5 years. But it seemed that this partnership, this alliance between the civilians and military is not working. And we could sense that in the initiative of Prime Minister Abdala Hamdok, when he made an initiative in July 2000 this year, and also he repeated that in October. So I don't think the issue now is the military. I think the issue is the partnership. It is a difficult partnership and it is not working because the agendas of the civilians and the agendas of the military are not identical. So many institutions of transitions are not established, especially in the judiciary aspects. The Supreme Council of Judiciary, the Supreme Council of Prosecution, the Legislative Assembly. So there are a lot of justice issues are pending, and that made this partnership very difficult and cannot achieve its goals.
Okay, let me ask Cameron Hudson. I mean, so according to Babikir there, they tried, but it doesn't work. And we heard Prime Minister, Hamdok say that this is actually a battle between those who believe in a transition to democracy and those who simply don't. Is it that simple, or is it just a failed partnership?
No, I think it's that simple. I think that what we have seen for the past 2 years is an effort by the military to essentially slow roll this transition. It has allowed the civilian government to make reforms in those areas of the politics and the economics of the country that did not affect their core interests. But over time, the civilian government was running out of reform efforts because there were vast parts of this country that were still tightly within the grip of the military. And so if the civilian government was going to be able to respond to the demands of the Sudanese people, at some point, it was going to have to impact the military's interests. We have come to that point in this. The military had no other place to run. They had been pushed into a corner by 1 million people who took to the streets earlier this week, and by overwhelming international pressure to continue this reform process. So, faced with very few choices, they took the one that was the easiest and most available to them. But I would caution that they did this knowing full well what the consequences of their actions today would be. The United States and other international donors have put the Sudanese on warning that if the military tried to consolidate power over the civilian government, that they would be met with stiff penalties. First and foremost, a suspension of all of the promised assistance to Sudan that was aiding in the economic recovery. So they did this knowing full well what the consequences would be.
Okay, Cameron, just quickly, and for some perspective here, when you hear parallels drawn right now between what's happening in Sudan and what we saw and have been seeing in Myanmar, do you think that's a correct parallel? The military junta there also said they would oversee a transition to democracy. They've really done no such thing. So are we seeing these similar patterns developing now in Sudan?
Well, I don't know that Myanmar is the right example. I think that, Sudan is, was being held up as a potential model for how these transitions could work. I think when you look at Chad, when you look at Mali, you look at Guinea, there are a host of countries in the broader African region that are undergoing transitions from military to civilian rule, and Sudan was being held up as a potential model for how that might happen, where you have an actual partnership between the military and civilians that sort of eases the military into a new role. Over time. I think what we have seen now from the events just in the last few hours is, in fact, that the military was essentially paying lip service to that effort, but likely had no intention of actually following through on the many requirements of moving towards civilian rule. And so I think that we have a lot to contemplate now in terms of next steps going forward and what this means for broader efforts to bring democracy to this region.
Okay, Elmahdi, I can see you agree there, but let me turn to Mohamed. I want to bring you into the discussion, of course, and I need to look at something else with you, very important. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan mentioned that there is a need now to fight what he called a racist agenda, that is what they're really doing this for. It's something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the foreign press. So I have to ask if we've actually been underestimating something particularly insidious in Sudan. We know now in eastern Sudan that the Beja tribe has been accusing the government of failing to represent them. They forced the closure of Port Sudan and have now reopened it off the back of the military takeover. Are there serious issues of ethnic discrimination that we haven't been talking about here that are playing into the military's actions?
Actually, Burhan's discourse is quite ironic because he was the one who infused the racial and the identitarian divide that is causing the calamitous situation now in eastern Sudan. And let me bring about the Juba agreement that was signed in 2020, which introduced the Eastern Accords, which were opposed by the Juba. The ones who lobbied to introduce these accords or to include the Eastern Accords in the Juba Agreement were the military, including Shamsuddin al-Kabashi and Mohamed Hamdan Daglo Himeti. So it's quite ironic for him to speak of the identitarian and racial divide in Eastern Sudan, and he was the one who marginalized, and his allies themselves who were the ones who marginalized the Juba, the Bija tribe itself. And let me add something else too, which is the fact that the leader of the Bija tribe, or the self-acclaimed leader, Mohamed El Mustafa, is also trying to take advantage of the identitarian divide in order to further his political interests too. And he was the one who mobilized his own tribe in opposition to the appointed governor of Kassala, Saleh Ammar, using the racist rhetoric, claiming that he was an Eritrean and that the Bani Amir did not belong to East Sudan.
It's very interesting, Mohammed. Would you almost describe then what the military is doing as a very cynical kind of divide and conquer approach?
It is a divide et impera approach. In fact, such tactic was used and utilized by Umar al-Bashir in East Sudan before, as he, as at the beginning, the Bija Congress, which signed the Asmara Accords with the government in 2006, are right now the lapdogs of the government itself and the military apparatus in particular. And right now, he's trying to whip the entire Juba process in servitude to his agenda. And I won't say that his agenda is to transition from some sort of a puppet government. I would say that he wants to transition the country to a direct military rule. However, such rule will face immense resistance from the people, not just in the center, but also in the peripheries. And we have to add something else. The so-called economic reforms, which are promised by the West, are also facing resistance, and even the military government is going to implement them. I'm speaking of the structural adjustment programs, which were introduced by the IMF in particular.
Okay. Al-Mahdi, let me ask if you think the same, strategies that Mohammed was outlining are indeed at play. Is this what the military is trying to do? And then also, the protesters we're seeing that are pro-military takeover, is there a case of them not having given the civilian government enough time or enough of a chance, or have they just been manipulated so far by the military in this equation?
Let me start by pointing out that Mr. Mustafa, what he said is right in so many levels. And to add on that, the military being the 800-pound bear in charge of so many aspects of life in Sudan, being it political, economical, or racial, has been always a direct factor in compounding, and a compounding effect in making things worse, because the military do have the lion's share of the budget. For the past 30 years, they have been utilizing like 80% of the budget. So you can imagine how much they are invested in the status quo to continue. And as to them, those the few hundreds who were manufactured a small crisis by and large being sanctioned by the military council, and which is now a military council, that's its name, and by the Coup itself, they were paid agents in facilitating somehow of a camouflage to entertain the idea that, yes, there is some civilian forces and some civilian aspect parties that are lending support to them, Al-Burhan and his agenda, which is in fact the whole thing in Eastern Sudan that does not, it's manufactured, yes, but that does not mean there isn't a problem in Eastern Sudan. But the way it's utilized and the way it's used to help facilitate what happened today would tell you a lot about why the military needs to stay in power.
Let me get back to Babikir, because to go back to your position on this, you just seem to think it's a failed relationship between the military and the civilian government that was in place there. But having heard the rest of our panelists describe these kind of cynical strategies that the military has deliberately put into play, are you convinced at all that more responsibility does lie with the behavior of the military?
I think there is lack of trust to start with between the civilian and military components. Although there are genuine issues in Eastern Sudan, in Darfur, the race issue is a real issue in Sudan. Recently, we heard the response of Wajdi Saleh. Wajdi Saleh was the Secretary General of the powerful committee for dismantling the power of the previous regime. He labeled those who sat in front of the presidential palace as they don't look like us. So the issue of race is there. The issue of marginalization in Eastern Sudan was there. When the previous regime was toppled, there was a component of the resistance forces in Eastern Sudan who had signed treaty with Umar al-Bashir, Mabruk Salim and Musa Muhammad Ahmed. They have got their shares in the power. Musa Muhammad Ahmed was an assistant to Umar al-Bashir. So when this new government came, they labeled Musa Muhammad Ahmed and Mabruk Salim Mubarak as those are previous regime men. They called them the Fulul.
Right.
The Fulul, that means the remains of the previous regime and the supporters. So what they have done, they have isolated all these regional powers from sharing in the power. For instance,
we're running really short on time, so I do want to get to our other panelists as well. And I just need to pick up then on, with Mohamed about what you think of what Babikir's opinion of the situation is, because it does differ from yours. And I'd also like you to explain then, for as far as the pro-military protesters are concerned, what are their real grievances then? Why are they out there? Why are they really against this transition to democracy? It can't just be because they've somehow been almost brainwashed by the military.
Well, I won't say that that they are brainwashed, but someone has to address the need to bridge the divide or the huge gap between the several competing political factions and what is perceived in the grassroots. I think both of their approaches to the political crisis is quite distinctive. However, let me comment on some points which were mentioned by Mr. Babikir, because of course Wajdi Saleh's statement was taken out of context and published by few militaries, by few NCP and the military council supporters. And he wasn't hinting or wasn't trying to use dog whistle politics rhetoric, of course. And let me add too the fact that if you want me to comment about the second sit-in, which is in front of the ministerial administration. Well, some of their grievances are legitimate. I mean, the government has been really reckless when it comes to dealing or forming a relationship with the Vijay Congress. And some of them, in fact, joined the NCP or allied themselves with the NCP and their agenda too. And one has to point or view the Orwellian aspect of the term trust issue, because the military never had any vested interest in the economic transition. If they had a vested interest, they would have handed over their assets to the civilian government. If they had vested interest, they would have proceeded with the DRR procedures after the Juba agreement. If they had vested interest in the transition, they would have negotiated in good faith with Abdulaziz al-Hilu and Abdul Wahid Mohammed Noor. And it's not to whitewash these figures who fought the government. However, I mean, they're cynical and mercenaries themselves. However, if the government or if the military leadership had vested interest in the transition, we would have seen that for the past couple of years. But what we have seen was an obstructionist was an obstructionist and a sinister, was a show of their sinister motives. That's it.
Understood. Let me wrap up quickly with Cameron then, because this is from the outside. We're looking at, you talk about the international pressure. We see the African Union, the Arab League, the UN, the EU all condemn this military coup. How much do you think that pressure will amount to on the ground in Sudan and potentially stopping the military from going forward with completely stopping the transition to civilian rule?
I mean, it's going to have no effect whatsoever. All of those warnings came 2 weeks ago when the military first hinted at the possibility of a military coup. They were gauging the response from the international community and their own domestic audience. That response was overwhelmingly against the idea of the military coming back into any more prominent role. So they have received warnings over the past 2 weeks of what would happen and internationally if they went forward with these plans. They moved forward with this coup, knowing full well that the condemnation would be quick. That it would be severe, that they would lose access to international financing, that there could be sanctions that follow. So they did this because it's an existential threat. They faced a threat to their hold on power, their hold on the economy. They feared that they could be accountable to the ICC for crimes committed in the past, and that's why they did this, to protect themselves.
Okay, Cameron Hudson, I will have to let you have the final words. So unfortunately, we've run out of time. So much more to talk about, but I'd like to thank all four of my panelists really so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. I'm Andrea Sankey. Thanks for watching.